Whenever I come up with an idea, it usually takes me a long time to get it all worked out because I have so many different ideas that go in so many different directions, and it takes me like a week just to separate everything and actually start putting the pieces together on one idea. And I usually have multiple theories that I try to force into one, but I'm going to just put them all in separately, so there's going to be multiple theories in each of the videos from now on. I've always heard there's only 7 different types of stories you can tell. 7 basic plot points that every story follows. And for most movies you can tell which one of these it fits into right away, but sometimes you get a movie like I Am Legend that doesn't fit into any of these categories, and it doesn't even know what type of movie it is. It feels like it's stuck in between wanting to be an action, drama, sci-fi thriller, but it also tries to be a horror movie sometimes. Now most people think this story is about a man trying to survive in a world that's been taken over by light-sensitive zombies. And because of that, I'm sure they would say it's overcoming the monster. But he never actually overcame the monster. And if we use the perspective from the book and all the other movies, Robert Nevel is actually the monster. And even though there's been 2 other movies that adapted this book before, this one is so different than the others that it loses the meaning and the purpose of the story it's supposed to be adapting. The Last Man on Earth is the most faithful to the book, and the Omega Man starts out like I Am Legend, but instead of vampires or hyperactive zombies, it's a disease that turns everyone into albino mutants. So the basic frame of the story is the same, and because it isn't technically a horror movie, the focus is on the psychological effects of isolation and not so much about the vampires. The original story plays with our perception of what good and evil look like because it tricks us into believing that Robert Nevel is the hero of the story, only for us to find out that he's really the monster in the end. There's an old Twilight Zone episode called Eye of the Beholder where a woman's getting plastic surgery to try to look normal, but in the end we find out that she does look normal. It's just that she lives in a world where everyone looks different, so they think of her face as deformed. This highlights how perspective can influence our perception. Because we see a man trying to save the world, but from their perspective, he's a monster that kidnaps them when they're sleeping so he can do experiments on them in his underground dungeon. I Am Legend is a strange mix of so many different ideas and themes, and there's so many unanswered questions and things that can be seen as plot holes, but I never see anyone try and come up with an explanation for it. The 2007 movie is very different than the others because it's the only one where the vampires can't talk. And we never get a clear explanation on if they're zombies or vampires, so we don't even really know what they do when they catch people. Now I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but the reason the original story was called I Am Legend was because those are Robert Nevel's last words. In the final chapters of the book, he realizes that he's probably the last human alive, and after he dies he'll become a legend that the vampires tell their kids and grandkids about. And the 2 other movies basically stick to this idea, but in a story where they can't talk, how could he ever become a legend?
What if Robert Nevel and the Darkseekers were never real, and they were just a story created by the survivors?
The first half of this movie is grounded in reality. There's no ghosts or aliens or magical powers, but about halfway through, a mannequin turns his head when he drives by, and everything after this moment starts to feel like a completely different movie. There's a scene in the Omega Man where another survivor is hiding by pretending to be a mannequin, but it was more effective because at that point in the story, we didn't know there were any other human survivors. But this one goes from being an examination on loneliness and isolation to a full-on action sci-fi blockbuster where the Darkseekers can climb walls and break into a house with their bare hands. And we're supposed to believe that they can't talk or build things, but they somehow understand how to set a complicated snare trap, and they understand that Nevel had an emotional connection to a specific mannequin. And the movie even tries to tell you this doesn't make any sense.
The infected didn't do this, they can't. They have no higher brain function, they don't plan or hate, they don't love, they can't.
We don't know a lot about the Crippen virus, but we do know that 90% of the world died from it and 1% turned into the Darkseekers. But what if there never was a 1%? And all the survivors just built safe zones far away from the city so they could avoid catching the virus. And the Darkseekers was just a story they made up, kind of like the monsters in the village, so people would be too afraid to leave the safe zone. Because you have to admit that Robert Nevel does sound like a legend. He's a high-ranking military officer, a virologist, and he's immune to the virus. He's running around the city, jumping out of windows, staring down lions, and risking his life by staying in New York and having confrontations with the Darkseekers. And his daughter basically prophesies that he would save the world because of the butterfly. This is the only way the name I Am Legend would be relevant to the story because the entire movie would be a legend told by the humans and not by the vampires. There's a lot of strange things in this movie, but as far as the plot goes, the biggest unanswered question I had was Nevel's objective. The entire reason he's staying in New York is because he's trying to find a cure to the Crippen virus. But even if he had the cure, how does he plan on giving it to millions of infected people? In the book, Nevel isn't so confident, and his attempts to find a cure just feel more like a desperate man that doesn't know what else to do. This is a very different interpretation of Matheson's book because it introduces so many new ideas to the story, so it has to be analyzed like it's a completely new idea. Remember that I said perspective can influence our perception? Well, let's get deep on this one.
How deep?
I'm talking about balls deep. I'm talking about balls deep.
What if I told you that none of this is actually happening? And the virus, the Dark Seekers, and even Robert Nevel are all in a movie inside of this movie. The opening scene is the most important scene in the movie. It establishes the tone and the focus of the story, and it acts like a prologue chapter in a novel. It's typically shown before the credits, and it gives the audience necessary information about the plot and characters, and it usually feels like a short film that captures the essence of the rest of the movie. A great example of this is the opening scene in The Ring. There's two girls talking about a cursed videotape that they watched, and they get killed by something that comes out of the TV. And that told us everything we needed to know about the story. If you watch this cursed videotape, you'll die in 7 days. The first scene in I Am Legend starts with something that probably only I would notice, but there's a doctor on a TV show wearing all blue with a blue background, and they decided to name her Dr. Crippen.
What?
The opening scene is really important to setting up the story. But if you think this movie is about the world being destroyed by a virus, then this opening scene doesn't actually tell us anything. But if you look at it from my perspective, this scene is the only real thing that's happening, and everything else is in a movie. She's explaining how she cured cancer, and she uses the analogy of a bad man in a fast car. And then it cuts to Robert Nevel driving a fast car. Now, that's an interesting way to introduce the protagonist because at this point we don't know who he is, so the first impression is this is the man she's talking about.
If you can imagine your body as a highway and you picture the virus as a very fast car being driven by a very bad man.
And just like the programs in the Matrix are presented as humans, I Am Legend is a movie personifying what curing cancer will look like inside of a person's body. And it uses Dr. Crippen's analogy as the foundation for the plot. So New York City is the body, the Dark Seekers are the cancer, and Robert Nevel is the cure. I told you I was going to get deep on this one. And we have to acknowledge that the introduction to the story is shown through a TV, and it's also in a different aspect ratio than the rest of the movie. Well, it's technically still shot in 21:9, but it's recording something that's shot in 4:3, so it makes it look like we're seeing this through the eyes of someone else watching it inside of the movie. Because the 21:9 is the third person perspective that we're watching it from, so any other aspect ratios means we're seeing it from somebody else's point of view.
Did you understand a single word of what he just said?
But the biggest clue that this movie is about cancer and not a post-apocalyptic disease is the butterflies. We see a lot of butterflies throughout this movie. And on the surface you might think it's just a reference to Nevel's daughter, but here's the problem with that idea. We see butterflies in so many insignificant places that Nevel doesn't even see, and the butterfly is used in two completely different ways in both of the endings. In the theatrical ending, Nevel sees the butterfly in the broken glass, and then he sees it on Anna's neck, so he decides to kill himself so she can escape with the cure. And in the alternate ending, the alpha draws a butterfly on the glass because he just wants his girlfriend back. So the butterflies are important enough to be the focus of both endings, even though they have two completely different meanings. Why would the director do this? Why is the butterfly so important? Butterflies represent rebirth, change, and hope, and butterfly wings are often combined with the cancer ribbon. Now, it can't be a coincidence that there will be a symbol for cancer all over the place in a movie that's really about curing cancer. The most important location is the video store. It's the only place that Nevel has any emotional connection to. It's the only place where we see him set up mannequins like they're real people. The video store is the only place he visits more than once, it's the first place he goes after his dog dies, and it's the place he goes to for intimacy. There's a mannequin that he flirts with and he emotionally breaks down in front of, and it's no coincidence that she's standing in the adult section. Now, the movies don't focus on it much, but Nevel's sexual desires and loneliness play a much bigger role in the books because every night the vampires would show up to his house and try to break in, and sometimes the women would get naked and say sexual stuff to him. It's the reason he ends up dying in the end, because one of the female vampires is able to convince him that she's just a normal human, but she's really just a new type of vampire that's immune to garlic and sunlight, and she basically shows up at the same time in the story that Anna does. But the movie doesn't make Anna a vampire, so there was really no point to having her in the story. But what if Anna is just like the woman in the book, and she's infected with the Crippen virus, but she just doesn't show any symptoms? Anna doesn't have any of the character development that Ruth does, so it feels like she's only in the story so Nevel can have a reason to explain the plot to us. In the book, all the vampires are basically like zombies that lose some of their intelligence and memory, but Ruth is part of a new group of vampires that didn't, and they want to kill all the humans so they can start to rebuild society. What if Anna was going place to place looking for survivors so she can tell the Darkseekers where they are so they can come and kill them? And the whole reason she didn't kill Nevel right away was because she was trying to figure out if he knew the location to any other survivors or what type of experiments he was doing. This will make the original ending pretty fucked up, because after Nevel died, Anna goes to the safe zone, and if my idea is right, she's gonna learn whatever she can, and then the Darkseekers are just gonna show up and kill everyone there too. Because nothing about her character makes any sense. This takes place 3 years after the world was taken over by the vampires, and somehow she survived that long, but she doesn't even have a gun. You can find a short backstory online, but none of this information is in the movie, so it really doesn't matter. And we have to look at how she found Nevel in the first place. Every day he broadcasts a message telling people that he'll be in this location every day when the sun is the brightest, and somehow Anna can hear this message, but she couldn't send one back to him for some reason. And she shows up in the middle of the night like she didn't know that the Darkseekers can only come out when it's dark. It's like, how the hell did she survive this long? And why wouldn't she have waited until it was daytime instead of just driving around hoping she would see Nevel outside in the middle of the night? The only thing that makes sense is that Anna isn't what she says she is, and she's basically working for the vampires and hunting down all the humans. So what do you think? Which one of these ideas do you like best? Do you like Robert Nevel being a legend that never existed, or the story being a personification of curing cancer? Or my personal favorite is Anna is really a vampire like she is in the book. And what do you think about this new approach to these ideas? Do you like me having multiple theories in each video, or should I just go back to having one big complicated one?